Very excited to be here. My name is Nicole Davis. I am a creative producer. I'm moderating today's talk, and I'm thrilled to be joined by two panelists who are here to tell us about their partnership. It's Clare Chadburn, who is Director of Original Content at Audible, who has exec produced award-winning podcasts including I Am Not Nicholas, The Bias Diagnosis and Defiance with Michael Johnson, and Sheun, Adelasoye de Nicola, who is an exec producer working across development and production for Raw Factual, specialising in feature docs and podcasts. Welcome to you both. Thank you so much for being here. As we're here to talk about stories, I thought a good place to start would be your origin story as this partnership, and kind of how it came to be and why you decided to start working together in this medium.
Do you want to start? Yeah, I'll start. We really wanted to bring stories to a different audience. And for us, it's always about the story. And we, as a company, our strategy is to continue to make premium content, and Audible make premium audio. So they just seem like the perfect partner to bring our ideas to.
And as a producer of premium audio storytelling, we really want to work with the best people in the business. And, audio podcasting or narrative storytelling in the factual space is still in its very early stages, really, in terms of the industry. And we're growing, we're evolving, we're learning about how to tell the best stories. And so we're really open to working with producers from film, from TV, who have been working in storytelling for such a long time, and seeing how that marriage of audio and film and TV expertise in storytelling can, bring new stories to life in new ways.
And perhaps you can tell us a little bit about the new stories that you're cooking up together. What podcasts have you got in the pipeline?
Yeah, so the two stories that Raw brought to us, which immediately we thought this is exactly the kind of story that we want to be telling at Audible. The first will be released later this year, and the next one in 2024. And so the first is Daisy's story. So Daisy was transracially adopted, and she found out that she was conceived by an act of child rape. And the story is her pursuit of justice for the crime, of which she is the second victim, the first being her mother. And so it's a really tough story, but it is Daisy's, and we are telling it with Daisy. She is going to take us through this story, and as you'll hear when it comes out, it is so much more, so much more than that. Sheun, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, Daisy's story, it appears to be a harrowing one, but the way in which our amazing... the way in which our amazing producer, Emma Barnaby, has worked with her is you get a sense of her as a full person. She's not just that origin story, she's so much more, which makes her so relatable. It honestly is an incredible series, and we're really happy to be working with Audible, who really got that that's how we wanted to tell that story. Because you can tell those stories in so many other ways, which are a lot simpler, but the way that we've done it and the time that we've had to get that right has been really exceptional.
So that begs the question, why, given that Raw are kind of new to audio, that you are, very prolific in the feature doc space, and as you say, these stories can be told in so many other ways. Why did podcasting feel like the best fit for these stories?
I mean, as creatives, Raw has amazing developers, amazing filmmakers, but when we're developing ideas, sometimes some ideas lend themselves more to podcasts. Like Daisy has an issue with anonymity because her mother is a recognised victim. And just being able to tell that story in a very intimate way, her having a very small team around her, working closely with a producer, it's so much more intimate and accessible for Daisy to tell her story in that way than it would be if we were to film her, in the dark, covering her anonymity and her worrying about whether she's being recognised or not.
Do you think there's more control for the contributor kind of in this medium?
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
So how do you exert that?
I think it's very much about collaboration. It's her working with, because it's her story, and Emma's the producer, and she's working with her. She's using her experience as a producer. She knows how to tell a story. But at the same time, Daisy has to buy into that. And that is about trust and time. But that gives her a lot of agency as well. And I think that was really appealing to her in terms of telling her story in this way.
And Claire, do you want to tell us a little bit about the second podcast that you're developing as well?
Yeah, so there's the second podcast, the working title for that podcast is Cursed. And this is the story of an international people trafficking ring who are trafficking women for prostitution from West Africa into Europe. And they were using the power of a West African curse to control the women. And so this focuses on the story of Josephine Iyamu,
yeah.
that's right, who is at the centre of this and who was the woman who was responsible for organising this, this trafficking of women. And again, what's interesting about this story to us is that it has those twists and turns and like stranger than fiction characters that are so compelling in the story space, but it also has this incredible depth and an incredible backdrop of all of these different places that we pass through on this journey of this story, that it allows us to make tell a story that is compelling and that will be thrilling to listen to, but at the same time really, really paints this deep picture of what does international people trafficking look like, who are the forces who are trying to kind of prosecute for these crimes and how do they do it, but also the role of women, and particularly the role of Josephine, which is really interesting, and the role of women in West Africa as well, and the culture. And the producer Georgina has been working really hard with a big team around her as well to kind of go out to Nigeria and get these stories of the women as well, and really find out what's happening there, probably in a way that might be challenging in film perhaps, but in the podcast world we can be quite nimble in terms of going to different locations and gathering.
Yeah, because the equipment is smaller, it's more intimate. You can follow stories that you're seeing, traveling through a market. You can just move from story to story. And what's incredible about that series is that we've been able to collaborate with other Nigerian producers and researchers. It was really important to us that it had a level of authenticity in that story, because so often when you get a story about a minority, you might have one person in the team who's supposed to speak for everyone, and one person cannot have the same opinion as everybody. They can't speak for an entire culture. And what was just really amazing, because I'm of Nigerian heritage, Femi Oke's Nigerian heritage, but British born, is that we have different opinions about certain things, and that's not always considered. And our producer in Nigeria had an opinion, our researcher had an opinion, and it was really about collating those thoughts to make sure that we did that story justice, in the sense that not only can a broad audience learn and understand why this curse had so much power over these women and not just see them as silly, but also for a Nigerian audience to say, yeah, I really get that, I understand that, and I don't feel that it's an outside producer making this. It feels very authentic and it's true to that story.
I think the thing that strikes me most about both the premises is how kind of hard-hitting and complex they are. And I'm wondering if you think that podcasting is particularly suited to dealing with something that has such kind of multi-layered themes and, is able to go on tangents and rabbit holes, but sort of keep listeners coming back. Is that why these stories feel especially suited to podcasting, and that you can kind of mine those depths and treat them with the nuance that you're speaking about?
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, the benefit of telling these stories in podcasts is just the scale. The story of the traffickers is a 10-part series. We're able to follow threads in such an intimate way that we just wouldn't be possible on a sort of a television schedule at all. And, working with Daisy as well, she's obviously had a lot of trauma, so we need to be sensitive to that. And the schedule has to adapt to how she's feeling in that moment when she's exploring a certain level of her story. And we've been able to do that. And I think that's why those stories lended themselves particularly to podcasts.
And what does it mean to tell a good story in audio? Kind of what tools are you grasping at in order to kind of maximise and utilise the medium, you know, at its best?
I mean, I think, you know, there are many things we can do. I think there's a sort of scale of experience in podcasting from the really intimate listen that you get, you know, the one voice in your ear kind of experience, the storytelling experience that you can get from podcasting that is so unique. You know, you're speaking to one person through headphones or in a room or that kind of thing. And then on the other side of that, and I guess on that point, you know, you've got that one-to-one relationship with a producer who can, you know, help to realise that. And then on the other side, you know, we can create a really cinematic experience through use of sound recordings, sound design, and also Audible now using Dolby Atmos to kind of place the listener in the centre of that story. And it can feel very big and very rich. So we've got quite a lot of tools that we can kind of draw on in terms of the sound and the different contrasts that we can get within a story, particularly like Cursed, where you're going from, you know, intimate storytelling through to big locations and, you know, the streets in Africa. So yeah, there's lots we can play with, but also, you know, the format in itself is a movable feast. We can decide how many episodes we want. We can decide how long they should be. And, you know, we don't have to decide that at the beginning and commit to that. We can see how the process goes and what we need to tell that story in the best way possible. So we've got a lot of flexibility there as well.
Yeah, I think I've particularly really enjoyed that because sometimes you're in a very intimate moment that just needs space to breathe. And podcasting allows us to do that. You know, you don't have to cut to the next scene. It's just letting the listener sit with that thought and really understand it. And that, yeah, that's just really been incredible to work creatively in that way.
Yes, it's like not being afraid of like the pause or the space or not knowing. I think podcasts are quite good at sort of posing questions that they don't necessarily know the answer to. I just listened to Winds of Change, for instance, and, you know, the whole premise of that was about finding an answer, which never really comes. But I think there's something very beautiful about the open-endedness of the podcast. I wonder if that's what you're striving for with what you're creating as well. Do you have kind of a mission statement for the kind of podcast that you want to produce together?
I think it is. It's taking people into somebody's world, whether that's a very intimate world like Daisy's or a very big world like the world of people trafficking, and how do you place the listener in that world. And we've talked a lot with Deborah as well about and Emma about, particularly in the second in Daisy's story, about how we create pace and space within that story, because it is a very difficult story and that can be quite intense for a listener, you know, to take in one moment, and how by telling that whole story we get the highs and lows, we see the whole picture of Daisy, and there's some, you know, incredibly relatable light moments of Daisy's story as well. And, you know, working with that balance of pace and how much are you putting on the listener in that moment, how much can you receive as a listener, is something that we're really thinking deeply about as well, because it is so intimate. Yeah, but we can work through that in the process.
And how do you test that? Is that just about getting lots of ears on it and saying, how are you feeling after you've listened to this? Or is it just gut instinct?
No, I wouldn't say lots of ears. I would say that, you know, Emma's our producer and she's the lead on this, and Deborah executive produces alongside myself, Deborah Dudgeon, and we listen separately and we give notes, and then we talk together about it and what we feel works and doesn't, and then of course it goes to Clare and she tells us if we've got it right or not.
There is no right. There is no right. You know, what I love about this process of you know, working with collaborators like Raw is that it is a collaboration. I am learning, you know, from you in terms of your expertise in storytelling. And, you know, hopefully the other way is true as well. And we're kind of looking at what we know about our listeners and what they love about stories, because, you know, our listeners are coming to us for audiobooks. They are lovers of stories. They're, you know, very, they love narrative and they love depth and all of those things that people come to books for. And so we're sort of bringing that side to the table, plus maybe a fresh pair of ears at the same time. But, you know, there is no right and wrong. there is a collaboration, and you know, we should all be doing the right thing for the story. So, you know, I'm happy to be told if the decision has been made in a different direction for whatever reason that might be, and you know, that's how we work, really.
Yeah.
Sheun, I think what you said there about sort of Emma being the lead and having the vision is really interesting, because that is a difference between podcasting and filmmaking, where it might be the director that people turn to for the answers. But I'm wondering kind of what you think filmmakers, people that, you know, exist and work in the screen industries could perhaps bring across to audio, you know, whether there is transferable skills there that, you know, they might have honed or learned in film that they could kind of put to the audio storytelling.
Yeah, I think we as storytellers tell stories in kind of an unconventional way, in the sense that we take some tools from scripted, and that's how we focus our documentaries, which isn't always done in documentary making. But that focus on story and narrative that we have at Raw has made it, I wouldn't say easy because I'm still definitely learning, but has made it easier to work in podcasts, but also collaborating with really experienced podcasters like Emma, like Deborah, like Georgina has really, really helped. But just that focus on story and really thinking about, is this the best way to tell it? And what I love is that there's an element of play that we have, and there's time and space to really think about those things. And I would honestly say that for me, trying to learn to think in sound rather than pictures has been a real challenge, but an enjoyable challenge at the same time. I really feel that creatively, I'm certainly growing in that space. And I think that the skills that I'm learning from podcasting, I can definitely put into TV and film.
And I also wonder what consideration you give to how people are going to listen to these stories, because obviously with podcasts, the thing I love about them a lot of the time is that I can listen to them while doing something else, but it does mean your focus is often split. And are you trying to kind of do something extra to pull people in and keep them there?
I mean, I think it's heavily reliant on, you know, the power of testimony. And the way we tell the stories and when we put the twists and turns. And yes, you can be doing your ironing or washing or cleaning whilst you're listening to a podcast. But if something piques your interest, it piques your interest. And if you've got a good story, that's going to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd love to get a little bit more insight into the kind of the production pipeline and sort of how you go about bringing the team together and who it is that you're looking for, you know, how you hire the sound designers and the engineers and the technical people that work on these podcasts. Because again, that's something that often gets missed, is that the level of craft that goes into creating these shows.
I would say for the story with trafficking women from Nigeria into Europe, our producer, Georgina, found this amazing sound designer, Issa Williams, who is also a musician, but he travels all around Africa and, you know, collects sounds and is very, very rooted in that story. It was really important that, you know, when we're in Nigeria, we feel Nigeria. When we're in London, we feel London. When we're in the Midlands, we feel the Midlands. So we're really excited to collaborate with him on that. And with Daisy's story, what's really amazing is that Emma's like a triple threat. She's not only a producer, she sound designs, you know, she's a musician, and she's going to be doing the sound design for Daisy's story. And I think, you know, the fact that she has that relationship with Daisy really, you know, is so helpful for Daisy, because it's her story, it's very, very intimate, but somebody that has spent so much time with her, really understanding her, will know how to shape that sound design that she will be happy with, because she is trusting us to tell her story, and that's a real privilege. And, you know, we have to get it right, and that is a collaboration.
And you mentioned the small scale of the production and how it can perhaps be more agile than a film production, but I'm wondering whether that reflects the reach. Do you feel like you can reach the kind of same level of audience with podcasts as you can with kind of feature docs and films?
Well, we hope to. I mean, we really, really hope to. We've got some great stories. We wanted to move into a new medium. Of course, we're well known in television and film, but I think we can do it. I think that the stories are really, really strong, and I think that, I think podcast is something that everybody listens to. It's just where we are. It's, you know, it's the future. Of course, people still watch television and, you know, love going to cinema and watch film. But sometimes there are stories, you know, as we've mentioned already, that, you know, are just can be incredibly, they can be told so well in audio and at length. It's almost like a book, isn't it? You're in a different world.
And we're seeing that, from our customers as well, our listeners. A lot of these long-form narrative documentaries are at the top of our listening charts in podcasts. Titles like "I Am Not Nicola" or "Mother, Neighbor, Russian Spy," which are long-form, documentaries or investigations. And the listeners who have come to us for audiobooks are also discovering these stories and giving rave reviews, and we can see the popularity of these stories alongside those kind of traditional audiobooks as well.
And given that crossover, I'm wondering if we can talk about the production pipeline or the IP pipeline in terms of, are you testing these stories for other mediums, or are they purely standalone podcasts? Is there a larger strategy bubbling away in the background here?
For us, it's audio first. We want to be making premium audio stories, and we want to be pushing those boundaries in terms of audio storytelling and what can we do next and how can we craft this in an amazing way in audio. And, if that brings opportunities down the line, that's great. But yeah, for us, it's really first and foremost, the audio experience. And I think what's interesting about audio is that it does often allow us access to stories quicker than maybe they would be at film and TV, that nimble nature of being able to go somewhere with a microphone, or maybe being able to persuade a contributor who is nervous about sharing their story in film and TV, and they would feel happier doing it, on a microphone with one person, allows these stories possibly to come to audio faster as well. And so we can kind of, be telling stories often ahead of the curve of film and TV. Which doesn't mean that we're testing them out in any way. These are audio first for us, but it gives them a life elsewhere potentially.
And what about for Raw?
Well, for Raw, as I said, we are definitely all about the story. And yes, we make film and television, but we're also making podcasts now. And if that's the best way to tell the story, that's what we just want to continue to do.
And Claire, I'd love to come back to that word premium, because it is such a big part of what Audible do, but I'm wondering how you define it, or, how you, test it, again, to use that word, because obviously with, the intimacy of podcasts, you can kind of afford a little bit more. It doesn't always have to be cinematic. It doesn't always have to be like super polished. There is something, it's a trend, but there is something quite nice about maybe hearing someone turning on the microphone, or, the technical equipment failing, because again, you're kind of plunged into that moment. So how are you defining premium? What does that sound like for you?
Yeah, that's really interesting, because premium in podcasting doesn't necessarily mean, it's glossy and shiny and you don't hear what's happening in the background. In fact, sometimes the opposite. And that's a really interesting style that's coming through in podcasting and in storytelling. I think premium for us is, maybe exclusive access to a story, getting a story upfront, this being an original story, this being told in an original way, working with the best people in the industry, whether that's film, TV, or audio, being able to afford a long timeline on something to do it really, really well. So in the production process, it would be that, being able to pick the best and only work with the best stories. And then in the post-production side, premium for us is working with amazing sound designers, but also enhancing that sound with Dolby Atmos, with the leading sort of technology for sound as well, and making that feel big. And then when we put it out there, giving it an amazing chance through a brilliant marketing campaigns and that kind of thing to make it sing with audiences as well.
Let's pin that thought on marketing. I definitely want to come back to that. But also I'd love to, pick apart this word originality, because obviously podcasting is still quite a relatively new medium. And I suppose, the trends perhaps that initially evolved are still in place. What, again, does originality mean to you? How can we evolve what it is to tell good stories in this medium?
Yeah, I was reflecting on it this morning. Podcasting in itself is 20 years old. That is so new. And when you talk about audio documentary podcast and you think about Serial or S-Town, that is such recent history, in our industry in terms of the styles. And a lot of those things did come from America originally, but I think, in the UK we're finding our way of telling these stories in a really, original way. And I feel like every time we approach a new project, we learn something new, or we learn how to tell something in a new way. And you know, with Daisy's story, we are telling, I feel like we're telling something new in a new way, you know, from a personal point of view. You know, there is this kind of, I guess, a bit of a trope in podcasting of the journalist kind of showing their working out and taking you on this journey. But, you know, this is Daisy doing that in a very personal way with Emma. And you will see some of the tensions that come from, you know, her journey through telling her story in this podcast, and being very honest and open about, you know, what that process is. And I think that is something that podcasting can do that doesn't always have the space to do in film and TV, is be really honest about the impact of telling that story, or the, you know, if we look at something like I Am Not Nicholas, you know, the impact of getting close to a protagonist and how that feels, and, you know, being able to share that openly rather than just telling the story, looking behind the scenes as well.
And let's talk about marketing, because obviously it is a new but saturated market. How do you set up a podcast to cut through?
Interesting. I'm winking at head of marketing in the front row, because I don't, you know, we have a whole team who work on brilliant, amazing marketing campaigns. And, you know, you may have seen on the tube or, you know, walking through the station, you know, big campaigns for some of our originals titles that also exist on social media as well. And they're bespoke for, you know, every single podcast that we release. I won't comment on all the details, but if anybody wants to ask more about marketing, Albert's here on the front row. But yeah, you know, we do back every single title that we release. We back with an amazing PR and marketing campaign to make sure that people know that this title exists out there. You know, and hopefully they'll see it and think that's the one for me. I'm going to take up, you know, a subscription and go and listen to that. But also with our customers as well, you know, we've got all these people coming to us who love stories. You know, maybe they're coming to us as audiobook fans and they haven't experienced a podcast yet. So, you know, telling our existing customers about the new podcast that we've got is also an important part of what we do.
And is that something you're in collaboration with in terms of Raw as well, and thinking about the audience for Raw documentaries, such as, you know, Three Identical Strangers or The Imposter, and thinking about people that have seen those and might come for the podcast as well? Are you sort of giving each other intelligence in that way?
No, we're at the very early stages, so we haven't had those discussions, but, sorry, I brought this up again. We haven't had those discussions yet, but we're just sort of, you know, we talk a lot about how we want the series to sound, and of course we'll talk a lot about how we want it to look as well.
I think what's exciting is that there is such a big potential audience for podcasting. Some people have found it already, and it has that amazing word of mouth thing where people find a great podcast and they tell everyone about it. But, you know, people who love documentaries, I think, are starting to find podcasts, but I'm sure there's more of that audience that are yet to kind of discover. So that's really exciting.
How long do you give a podcast to succeed? You know, like, stories in cinema can exist, you know, for such a long period of time. People can kind of rediscover them. There's repertory cinema where, you know, cult classics suddenly come back and discover a new audience. Is there such a thing, you know, in podcasts? Or, you know, if it doesn't succeed in the first year, it's sort of, you know, gone and forgotten? What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, our podcasts all the podcasts we've made are on our site, you know, and they're available, and you can kind of, you know, find them. Obviously, when we launch a podcast, we have a big marketing campaign, and everyone will get to know about it. But often it's word of mouth, you know, or often you'll bump across it in a search, you know, looking for other things, you'll be recommended it, that kind of thing. And if you look at something like West Cork, which is one of our, you know, first narrative documentary podcasts, that really, there was a lot of word of mouth about that, and that, you know, still, you know, does great numbers in terms of people coming back and listening to that. And I think sometimes, you know, people might find one podcast and they'll come into Audible, you know, I'm Not Nicholas, for example, and then maybe they'll find others that are similar to that as well on the site, and then, you know, discover that way. But
yeah, presumably the library is a beneficial thing, because
yeah,
you're coming through the new thing and then discover that
yeah,
there's
exactly.
a wealth of content.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting that we're having this conversation at a film festival. There was a fiction podcast that debuted at Tribeca this year. You know, clearly there are kind of moves being made in these two industries. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on, you know, the continuing intersection of audio and film, how it might evolve, and what that future might look like for both of these industries. what your parts in it will continue to be.
You know, I hope that we will continue to make podcasts, and we will obviously continue to make television and film. I think that people's fascination with story, you know, factual stories is just increasing, and it absolutely makes sense to have, you know, audio documentaries at what is, you know, typically seen as just a film-only festival. It's a medium that people are consuming more and more every day.
And as I said at the beginning, we want to work with the best storytellers, and we want to see what they can bring to audio and how we can evolve, you know, this medium more over the next few years, particularly as well. And so, you know, we welcome further collaborations with the film industry or TV producers or storytellers, you know, to bring us stories that we can tell in audio that they think will be the best fit in audio for their story as well.
I can see a future where we have listening sessions and we're in cinemas and we're listening to a podcast together. I'm going to throw the questions out to the audience for a little bit and see if there are anyone that would like to ask our panellists some questions. Raise your hand and I believe we'll have a mic that can come to you.
I think lots of people still look at podcasts and sort of audio storytelling as like sort of a background thing, maybe while you're on the train or while you're driving. And so are you guys trying to challenge that? And if so, how?
Interesting. I mean, I'd slightly disagree in that some of our documentary podcasts, I think if you listen to a story that has those twists and turns and the, you know, that testimony, it can be as arresting, you know, in terms of in the same way that a film can be. You know, you can really be pulled in. I mean, personally, I like to walk around and listen to a podcast because I feel like the intimacy of that, the stories lock in my head. You know, I can hear those voices afterwards. So, you know, especially now with, you know, such amazing headphones and, you know, technology to listen with, I think, you know, you really can have a kind of a binge listen or a stop the moment, you know, stop the car kind of listen with a podcast, as well as, you know, that sort of casual listening, perhaps if you're listening on a speaker or that kind of thing. I mean, podcasts, there's such a range of podcasts. You can have chat podcasts, you know, you can have interview podcasts, and you can have, you know, these kind of premium narrative storytelling podcasts. I think with us being in that space, we're looking for those stop the car arresting moments. We're looking for that kind of, you know, you remember where you were when you heard that piece of audio. And so I would hope people won't be dropping in and out of listening.
Yeah, even if it's in the background, it's about tapping into that space in time for them and making it really worthwhile. That's what we're trying to do.
Yeah, but it is great. The thing about listening to podcasts is that you can do stuff at the same time. You can, you know, listen to it for 5 minutes or 5 hours, you know, at your leisure. So, yeah.
I suppose it comes back to storytelling though, in the same way that, you know, each line of dialogue has to earn its place, like each piece of information in a podcast, you know, totally has to, you know, be there for a reason. And I often find myself, you know, you might zone out, then you'll realise you've missed something crucial. So you have to rewind to make sure that you understand the story. So I think there's a similarity there in terms of how we build stories for the screen and how we build them for audio.
Yeah.
Thank you guys so much. I remember I'm new to listening to podcasts, but I, whilst driving, listened to the fentanyl. It was a Vice, America's fentanyl crisis on Vice, and I found it even more chilling that I could only hear the information. But my question is, just to Nicole's point, just before we started the Q&A, with this sort of shared experience of audio and podcasting, are you finding, how is the shared experience of listening to podcasts being explored? Because one thing that does differentiate it from cinema is that you can have 100 of us here watching something, but and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't necessarily know spaces where a group can like listen to a podcast. And so I'm curious if there are spaces already, but how you think that could be explored, so you have a podcast being shared within the collective, beyond like say on social media and culture, how is there a shared experience of this great work that's being made?
I suppose it's whether or not Raw would host like a premiere for your podcast, where you would gather lots of people and everyone would, hear the first 2 episodes at the same time. Is that kind of what you're...
Yeah, we certainly do that for film and television, and yeah, that's something we're definitely open to.
Yeah, I think it's, we're still exploring, all of this kind of territory, and I think those ideas are definitely really interesting kind of ways of like debuting, a first listen, like an album playback in that kind of way. Maybe, that could be a really interesting experience. On the more conversational side of podcasts, from the comedy or theatre, that kind of a podcast, they've really grown into the live space, and that's really interesting. Selling out live versions of their podcasts that are recorded at the same time. And so it'll be interesting to see, the equivalent in narrative documentary podcasts of how we can kind of grow that into a new space or debut it in a certain interesting way. And I think with the Dolby Atmos as well, being able to listen to it potentially in a cinema and have that, cinematic sound experience could be really interesting in the future.
I suppose that begs the question whether there are any other technologies that you're kind of looking into or exploring or borrowing from kind of the cinematic landscape.
Oh, good question. I mean, yeah, Dolby Atmos for us at the moment is the focus, and how can we bring that cinematic experience to the listen. So, we're working with a lot of outside studios, building expertise in how to build that into our post-production processes and training people up to kind of, enhance that. So that's our focus at the moment, but I'm sure there'll be other things down the line as well. How does technology play into what you're doing?
I mean, for us, it's sort of, is there a great way to enhance this story? Is there something else out there? And if there is, of course, we're open to trying that out, because we're all about innovation. Everyone is. So yeah, I mean, we're open to it, certainly.
Hello, I'm curious to hear about budgets and just having a range of, like, I imagine if it's just one person mostly recording by themselves, that's a different cost to if it's an international story where you have to go to lots of places. So I'm curious, like, what the range is, and another aspect of budgets, but budgeting, if a podcast is doing really good numbers at Audible, does that benefit the creator in residuals in any way, or is it sort of a buyout situation? I was curious to know a bit more about the financial side.
I mean, we probably wouldn't share any details about exact budgets or kind of deals in terms of that way. But I wonder if we can talk about what we were talking about before the panel, about the way that the teams are growing and how we're, sort of structuring teams. I mean, we work as commissioners, so we will commission Raw to, make the stories that they've proposed for us in that way, and they are Audible originals. But yeah, we're more and more kind of borrowing parts from the film industry and the TV industry in terms of how we structure those teams. So the teams are growing, and I think that's a benefit particularly for these, premium productions where there is so much going on. So maybe talk about a little bit about...
So we... Obviously, in sort of television and film, you have production management, and that is something that we have put into our podcasts so that our producers can really focus on the story and not worry about flights and locations. And I think Raw having that infrastructure has really helped make these podcasts, which, are 10-part series and an 8-part series. It just, on something with that scale, it is important that teams grow in a way that is beneficial to the final product.
Yeah, and I think we've moved in audio from that kind of one producer making a story and doing everything, whether it's booking flights to the final delivery, to bigger teams. And that's reflected in those budgets because, we want to make these big premium products. And so that does involve supporting producers, having exec producers on board. Story editor maybe, or production management, just to kind of help support that team. So, for us, that is supported by a bigger budget than it would be for a kind of one producer, two producers.
Who has to do everything.
Yeah.
Hi, so question for Claire. a bit more on the kind of fiction side rather than the true stories side. I'd be interested to know how much you're working with production companies in terms of your kind of content creation and how much you enjoy people coming to you outside of production companies, so whether it's writers, directors, coming to you with ideas.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I look after the factual slate. So I have a colleague, Lydia, who looks after the scripted commissioning side of things. But it works in a very similar way. You know, we might work with big production companies like Raw on the scripted side, and you know there'll be a process of pitching commissions and reviewing commissions that way. But we also have the Audible hub, which I can give you some details about. We can follow that up afterwards if you're interested, where people can submit individual ideas into Audible. And also I would say, like, on both sides of the scripted and the unscripted, you know, we often build bespoke teams as well. So we might use freelancers or freelance writers and kind of build teams from scratch as well, or perhaps we'll work with a producer to kind of bolster their team with other people that we think would really be beneficial to that project. So yeah, we really do look on it as a case-by-case basis, but scripted works in a similar way to what we do as well, working with outside producers and directors and writers.
Right, thanks. Because I'm just also thinking about that kind of crossover of ideas that are fiction but are based on true stories, which obviously is huge, particularly for Raw, is something that's been very big. And you would then collaborate.
Yeah.
Departments together.
Yeah, I mean we're a really small team, and so so we're always talking about different ideas, and yeah, crossover is really interesting as well.
I suppose the line of questioning there that I'm interested in is, you know, at what point you know a story is ready. You know, is there a development period for podcasts where we're all kind of cooking up the idea for a long time before presenting it to Audible? Did you kind of know what that pitch and that package should look like?
I mean, obviously getting access is important. Access and understanding what the story is that we want to tell. So that does take a bit of time, but it's also pitching the idea to Audible and them understanding the story and thinking it's something that their audiences will be receptive to. So it's definitely a collaborative process, but obviously as a production company, there is quite a considerable amount of work in terms of building trust with a contributor, getting access to a police investigation. That does take some time, but you know, those are the best stories. It takes time.
So the same level of things have to be in place as would be for documentaries. And what about for Audible? You know, did the story kind of come and you were like, yeah, ready to go, let's greenlight it?
I mean, sometimes those stories come and they're ready to go, but sometimes they also need a bit of development work, and we often do that, particularly in the factual space. We can release some development funds for the team to go away and secure access, or to build, you know, the episodic narrative overview for us to really understand that story. So, you know, sometimes we can release some funds up front to just kind of work out if this is a story that we want to tell. And in that period also we can do testing, concept testing, that kind of thing, just to see if there's an audience appetite for that kind of programme as well.
What does that look like? What's concept testing?
Oh, I mean, I guess it's kind of, what a lot of, commissioning organisations use, you know, just to look at, basic kind of titles or top lines and see if there's an audience interest and where that audience interest lies in terms of that particular idea. It just gives us an indication wider than our own team and our own perspectives in terms of, you know, whether there's an appetite for that kind of idea.
Is there anything else that podcast development entails that maybe kind of we wouldn't expect to find in sort of, factual or fiction filmmaking, in terms of how exactly you're testing out the idea or readying it to kind of be made? Obviously, in film, there's character work and dialogue, and you're refining the scripts over and over. But I imagine it's not quite the same in podcasts.
Yeah, I don't know how you do.
No, I think the way Raw work is that it's quite similar to film. So our treatments are quite detailed and worked up, and we have spent a long time thinking about how we might want to tell the story before we pitch it. They receive detailed treatments. Obviously, initially it's just the forming of an idea and it's not as detailed, but yeah, we have sort of submitted treatments that are quite detailed and characters that we've already sort of spoken to and understand what their specific story is. I'm not saying that everybody has to do that, but that's just the way that we do things.
But also, we understand, particularly in the documentary space, that stories change. And so there's kind of a baseline of what we would want to see, but we know that once you get involved in that story, it may change. You may get further access. There may be another 4 episodes you can add on to that story. And I think the flexibility of podcasts allows for that as well. We need to know a certain amount of things up front, but we don't need to have that, episode outline logged, because we know that that's going to evolve and change as soon as you start digging into that.
And is that just the mindset that you've cultivated at Audible, that you know that the story is kind of malleable and it might not go where you expect it to go? You're sort of not being too prescriptive about what it is.
I think it's just that mindset of doing the right thing by the story. And so if you find there's a curveball or a different part to the story that feels really important, that you can kind of take a step back and then maybe, slightly retell that story in a different way. So it may be, this is a made up example, but it may be that, somebody in the story becomes, a really important storyteller within that. Do they deserve to present the story, or do they deserve to be a bigger feature within the story? That could be something that you could look at, or you just may uncover things in an investigation. You just don't know where that's going to go until you're on the road, and so, we're just open to telling the story in the right way and to following leads, within the parameters of budget and schedules and all that kind of thing. But yeah.
Is there any sort of thought at Audible right now about any kind of interactivity down the road, or even currently thinking about that kind of things?
What do you mean by interactivity?
Could be interactive walking tours, for example, is one of those ways to do it. Any kind of gamification, any kind of interactivity, any kind of feedback from the audience to the podcast itself or the content itself.
I think that's probably slightly above my pay grade in terms of talking about kind of what Audible's ambitions are for the future in that kind of space. I think what we focus on particularly is making a series that can be a binge listen in this space. You could listen to it episodically, but we often release everything at the same time so that you can listen to it whenever you want to. And those stories are relevant, but also have an evergreen element to them as well. So if you were to listen to any of those stories in a year's time, they would still be relevant. And I think, the nature of podcasting means that you can walk and listen, and you can, take this content with you wherever you go. But yeah, I don't really know any kind of further plans of kind of bespoke interactive content. I mean, we definitely, look at reviews that come in on the site and, listen to kind of what our audience is saying about the programmes and feed that back into our process. But yeah, I guess it's slightly different to, radio or other mediums in that way where you can immediately interact with the people talking. It is more aligned to TV box set or film. In that it is its whole thing in itself, and it's kind of out there for people to consume in whatever way they wish.
I suppose that begs the question, why now? If certain podcasts are evergreen, how do you decide that it's the right time to tell a story? It could be any time, and there are certain kind of factors or non-negotiables that have to be in place before you would greenlight something.
I think we do look for relevance, why should we be telling this story now? But it might be a story from the 90s or the 2000s, and we would tell it in a way that, that you would feel satisfied with that complete listen. And so it's not, I guess, a news story in that way, but it should have kind of contemporary relevance, or the theme may be something, that is kind of more zeitgeisty perhaps. Like if you look at a program like Squid Scam, the program that we made about NFTs, that was really relevant in terms of those topics, an NFT scam, and the victims that were scammed out of money, within that story. That is kind of universal in that in terms of that being a scam story, but also really super relevant in terms of what you would learn about NFTs, how they're made, how what they are, or Bitcoin, or any of that kind of dark web online world as well. Felt very kind of now, if that makes sense.
And is the same true for Raw? Is that how you decide what projects to board and kind of prioritise and put energy towards?
I mean, I think it's a story that interests us if we think it's really important, and we have a lot of passionate creators, and we have a really supportive senior management team that we can talk to about ideas and say, we really want to make this is an amazing story and this is why we want to make it. And then we collaborate with other people at Raw and they all feed in, and if we believe in that story then we take it out to pitch. But it's not just about the commission, it's about the story that we're telling that we think is important.
Yeah, it kind of has to be a world that you live in, even though it's like smaller scale and it can happen much quicker. Podcasting's still hard and there's a lot of graft required and you have to spend hours listening to the audio. So it still has to be a story that you love and want to tell on kind of, a big level. Any other questions? Jake?
I get my name.
I know, sorry, it's just because I know you.
Hey, so I was just, I'm thinking about the podcast landscape at the moment, where you've got a lot of platforms, maybe a certain music streaming service that spent billions of pounds on making podcasts that are now freely available on all other podcast platforms. You've got Audible, you've got a lot of shows that are exclusive to you, but then something like West Cork then went out onto all the platforms as well. I'm wondering right now, as it's so chaotic with a lot of stuff being put behind walled gardens and then a lot of stuff being distributed for everyone, how you are navigating that landscape at the minute.
I mean, some of that I probably couldn't comment to, but we are a subscription service, so people pay an upfront subscription and they get audiobooks and they also get our exclusive and original podcasts, and that really is kind of our model within this world. So yeah, there have been things outside of the paywall, windowed kind of outside there, or available outside there. But our focus really is on that subscription world and what we can do within that space.
What about what's next? Can you talk a little bit about more broadly at Raw and at Audible, about any other projects that you have in the pipeline?
We've got lots of projects in the pipeline, but they're not announced yet, so I can't talk about them. So sorry to say that.
Fair enough. What about a project that you're particularly proud of? Either these that you can already kind of tease some content that that you've enjoyed working on, or something else that you feel like typifies or exemplifies your work at Raw.
I mean, we're really proud of these two podcasts. That we've done a podcast which was an accompany to the Tinder Swindler before, but these are standalone podcasts, and we're really proud of them because of the stories that they are. They're given a voice to women that have been trafficked. They're given a voice to a West African curse that, some people in the West may see as silly, but we're really being sensitive in terms of the way that we're telling that story. Daisy's story is absolutely incredible. She has changed the law now. I mean, she's so amazing, and I just think that the space and time that we've had to make this and the collaboration with Clare and everyone at Audible has been really, really incredible. It's been a creator's dream, to be honest, like just being able to say, what do you think about this idea? And, get an email back saying, yeah, that's great, why didn't you try this? Just having that space and that feedback, I think, has been, an incredible experience for us.
Have you found that your skill set as an exec producer has kind of changed or evolved? From working on previous projects that are factual, did you feel yourself having to kind of really go on a learning curve to do this work?
Yeah, absolutely. So, my background before joining Raw was in radio, which is not the same as podcasts at all. But I've always been really inspired by the power of testimony. So working on a podcast alongside experienced podcasters has been an incredible experience. I'm learning from them, certainly, and they're learning from me in terms of what we do in television and the way that we tell our stories, the twists and the turns, the spaces and the pauses, but just having that collaboration and being able to speak to somebody who's very, very creative, and the team being so small, it's just been an amazing experience.
Thank you. And what about you, Clare? Is there kind of a project that really stands out as being something that, set the benchmark or set the tone for what you want to create going forward?
Yeah, I mean, we're in a really exciting place in terms of our factual podcast at the moment, with some, super exciting podcasts to come, such as the releases with Raw. But we recently released I'm Not Nicholas, which was an investigation. I'm not going to tell you too much about the story because I don't want to give too much away, but I think it's been the most popular true crime podcast on our site since West Cork. And it's really, really thrilling listen. So I'd say that's really exciting for us. Mother Neighbour Russian Spy is another. Countered Terrorism, which was the individual stories of terror plots that were foiled, is also really thrilling to listen to. So I think we've put out a number of these kind of long-form narrative documentary series or investigations now, but we've got quite a lot of really exciting ones to come. So yeah, I'd say just go and explore and keep your eyes out ready, or your ears open, ready for the Raw releases to come.
Amazing, later this year. Thank you so much, Claire, and Sheun, thank you so much for Sundance for hosting this panel.